Another one from the library of the Museum of Timekeeping. I'm going to be talking today about Ruth Belville, who's a character from history probably not as well documented as she could be. She was famous for selling the time. By the mid-19th century, it might seem that selling the time wasn't really something that people needed anymore. Watches and clocks were now being mass-produced and were far more affordable to most people. However, accurate timekeeping still wasn't as readily available as you might think. Her father, John Henry Belville, in 1836 began working for the Royal Greenwich Observatory. At the end of his shift, he would set his trusty marine chronometer to the time as denoted by the Royal Observatory and would then head out onto the streets of London. He had quite a list on his books of businesses and offices and individuals who wanted him to disseminate the time as of the Royal Observatory via his chronometer. He charged a sort of subscription service fee, an annual sum of money paid directly to him and his family for this service. When he died, it was down to his wife and Ruth to pick up the business, which they did, and they carried it on all the way through until Ruth's death in 1940. It's funny to think that a trade like that would have carried on for so long. It really wasn't needed anymore. There were electric telegraph signals now which were available for all businesses to tap into, which would give them that same accurate time from Greenwich. However, Ruth's business kept going right up until it was decided that in her 80s it was simply no longer safe for her to be walking the streets on her own. One question that's always troubled historians about Ruth Belville is how on earth she kept her business going. Bearing in mind she stopped her business in 1940, which was 4 years after the telephone-led speaking clock service from the GPO was readily available. It's also about 30 years after the Standard Time Company set up their telegraph system to offer businesses the time through electric pulses. So how is it that an elderly woman was able to walk the streets selling the time to businesses? There are a number of factors to consider. The first, is it simply possible that people felt she was part of the furniture? Maybe they'd, as a company, dealt with her father and her mother before her and felt that it was only right that they kept that going to support her in her endeavours. It's possible. But also, Edward Wynne, from the Standard Time Company, made something of a mistake when he took her on in 1908. He wrote a letter to the Telegraph in which he made a number of very unflattering comments about her business, even suggesting that she was using her womanly charms to gain clients. It was never really exposed what he meant by that, but I think the intention is fairly clear. However, this had exactly the opposite effect to that he had wanted. Rather than putting her in complete disrepute, those comments made her a sensation up and down the country. People suddenly in the media were picking up this story of this wonderful old woman who was going to the Greenwich Observatory every day and getting the time and then disseminating it through London, and how that service had been running for sort of well over 50 years. And she became somewhat famous. People started stopping her in the street, everybody knew her name, and I think it was probably this, more than anything else, that enabled her to carry on her business as actively as she did. When she eventually did give up in the 1940s, she was 86 years old and had been on the streets selling the time for some 50 years. So what kind of timekeepers did the Belvilles use? Well, in the early days, when it was her father going out and selling the time, he used what was then a modern pocket watch. It may well have been one much like this one. This pocket watch is made by H. Samuel of Manchester and dates from the mid-19th century, so would have been probably right on the money in terms of date for Mr. Belville. And then when his daughter picked up the business, she had an Arnold and Son chronometer. Arnold and Son chronometers were famous for their accuracy, their precision timekeeping, so it was exactly the kind of clock that would have been great for this purpose. And so while not an Arnold and Son, This Smith & Son of London marine chronometer would have been very similar to the one that the Belleville family used. These were incredibly accurate clocks. They were at the pinnacle of precision timekeeping, designed specifically to remain accurate across the seas, across different humidities, different temperatures, with all of the movements of the ship taken into account as well. So for a woman or a man carrying this around London to disseminate the time, those kind of attributes would have been really useful. They weren't cheap pieces of kit either. It would have been a real investment for the family to purchase one of these chronometers. But as we know, her business was successful, as was her father's before, so it was a very sound investment in the end. It's safe to say there are a lot of interesting characters in the history of horology, and I hope that you've enjoyed learning a little bit about Ruth Belville and hers.